Hi guys, today we are going to be working on our sphere, and so we have a demo for this. Okay, this is a picture that I took whenever we talked about the sphere in class. Okay, so we have the light direction coming from here, we have our shadow over here, so I know that the light is up here because of the highlight and the shadow. And so we are going to take a round object to trace. This one I have like a lid from QT. In class, we're using the end of a cup, the wider end of the cup. Okay, but you want it to be about this big on your paper. And if you're doing this at home, you might want to measure out a piece of paper from your sketchbook. This is a 6" by 6" paper. So you could just measure that out. You don't necessarily have to cut it. I just cut it for class to make it easier, but if you're doing it in your sketchbook, you can just draw out the 6" by 6" section. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to put my circle towards the center of my paper, and I'm going to lightly trace around it. I want it to be super light, not a super harsh line, because if you look here, there's not a harsh outline around this, right? We can easily see the difference between the white and this dark background back here, but there's not an actual line like there is like in a coloring book. Okay, so we don't want that on our picture. So first I'm going to lightly trace around here with my pencil. And of course for this you do need a wooden pencil. So you can see my nice light line. It's not super dark. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start kind of mapping out where the shades are, the various shades are in my picture here. Okay, so the first thing is that my shadow goes maybe a little less than halfway up on my sphere here. And for me, because this is a little bit bigger than what we usually use, ours, the ones that we do in class are a little bit smaller, I have less surface area for my shadow. Okay, and then it hits, so that's about the midpoint of my circle, and it hits right about here. And kind of comes down this way. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I have my shadow drawn out, roughly. Okay, and I'm going to start kind of figuring out where my lightest areas are. Okay, so it looks like about here, and again, it appears a little bit different on camera than it does on my phone here, but here, it's a little brighter, I would say. Okay, and then we have this area here that's just it's a little bit darker. There's kind of like a mid tone almost here. And so I'm going to kind of put this in softly. Okay, these are just guidelines that I'm building in for myself. Okay, then I have this dark shape here that kind of reminds me of like the shape on a tennis ball maybe, or like a baseball. And so that hits right about here. Like so. Okay, and then I have this area down here that's just a little bit lighter. Okay, so I have all these lines drawn in where my different values are at. So whenever I'm shading this, it helps me keep that in mind. Okay. Okay, now whenever I'm shading this, I want to do the same type of shading that I did whenever I did my, my value scale. So I'm going to take my pencil, I'm going to put it in my hand across like this, and I'm going to put my my index finger here, and I'm going to move my fingertips out of the way. And then I'm going to start laying down my first layer. Now, what I want to do is I want to avoid this part because this is the brightest part on mine, and it's like a glowing white. Okay, so I want to avoid this for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lightly shade in my first layer, and I want to cover most of this except for this part right here. Okay, so I'm going to focus mostly here. Okay, so I'm shading this in. And I'm using a medium to light. Actually, I wouldn't even say medium. I would say probably just a light pressure. Okay, and it's a little lighter down here, so I'm going to focus kind of just on my darker area for now. So I know that this one is darker in my picture. Okay, that picture that I had on my phone is the same picture that's located on Canvas on the assignment page for the shaded sphere. Okay, so if you were not here in class, you can use that as a reference. Okay, but I'm just doing a nice even shape. Okay, now whenever I'm doing this, I don't want to have, a lot of people will tend to hold their pencil like this, and they'll do this. And even if I do a nice job of putting it close together, I still have a very liney looking shade. Okay, we don't want it to look super directional. We don't want it to have this type of texture. Okay, we do want it to have a nice smooth texture because that's the texture of our object. Okay, now if our object originally had a texture similar to this, then it would make sense to do that. Sometimes when you're drawing people or animals and you're drawing like hair, then you want to have that directionality. But since this is just a plain old sphere, we don't want that. So I can move in multiple directions, going back and forth, whatever's comfortable, but also to alleviate any weird directional lines that I might have. Okay, so I like to kind of go in a rounded, it's like I'm writing the number 0 over and over again. Okay, and I like to go in opposite directions because it helps fill in. Sometimes you get those little white spaces in there, and if you go the opposite direction, it helps fill those in a little bit better. Okay, now one thing that's important to remember is while you are working on this, make sure that you are not rushing this. Okay, if you recall from our video on how to create a value scale, we did about 7 layers on the gradient part, 7 layers, okay, of pencil. And you can't rush 7 layers of pencil. You want to slowly build it up, okay? Just like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race, especially when it comes to pencil work, okay? So I'm building up my first layer here. And again, I'm not really rushing too much, keeping a good pace. All right. So generally for me, I like to do the shadow towards the end, and then we'll add the background towards the end as well. Okay, so I have this here. Okay, and so my first layer so far is a little uneven. I have a couple spots that are a little bit darker and a couple spots that are a little bit lighter. Okay, the nice thing about layers is that this will help even those out. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend this over here, but I'm going to use a very light pressure. Okay, and I want to blend it so that this is a nice smooth transition. So I can still see that there is this darker area here, but it's not super obvious. So I'm pressing super nice and light on this part. Darken this just a tiny bit so I don't lose that section there. Okay, again, I'm not going super crazy on this. I'm just darkening it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go very, very light pressure here, as light as I can possibly go. Okay, especially around this area too. Okay, so I'm going to fill in the rest of this area using super light pressure. Okay, so I have this shaded in here. Okay, I'm going to very lightly, kind of just levitating over my paper, I'm going to soften up this area right here. So it's not a harsh circular outline, it's a very soft transition because that's how our light waves work. Okay, and a couple of things I want to do too is I want to kind of lighten up my line here, just a little bit. So I'm partially erasing it. And then I have a little bit of a line from my original mapping out, and it was a little bit too dark for this. I'm going to go back over that and smooth it out. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and add in my lighter areas down here. Okay, so just like I did up here, I'm going to press very lightly, because remember, we can build up our pressure, but it's harder to take it away. You know what I mean? So I'm going to build up my layers softly, smoothly. Okay, so I'm filming this in here. And remember, guys, we are not using finger blending on this. Okay, you not use your fingers. It doesn't give you any depth. I can totally tell the texture is not right if you've finger blended. Okay, so I'm just going to fill this in super lightly here. Okay, and then much lighter here. Right, so just barely touching my paper. Okay, I'm not super worried about this line because I know that right next to it's going to be where that shadow goes. Okay, so I have my first layers for everybody. Now I'm going to start in my second layer, and I'm going to press in a little bit harder on my darkest areas. Okay, and I'm going to lighten it up when I get to my lighter areas. Okay, so what that looks like is I usually start wherever it's darkest on my paper. Right, and I build up my layer. Okay, don't be afraid with your layers to build it up so that it's pretty dark in some areas, as long as it matches the values that you see in your picture. Okay, and remember, your picture might be a little bit different from mine. If you took your picture in class with us, you might have had yours from a different angle. So whenever you do this, you might have the light coming from this side because you were standing on the opposite side. That's totally fine. Just make sure that you are still shading it in according to what it looks like in your picture. Okay, so I'm darkening this up a little bit, and I'm going to carry this through here. Okay, it stays pretty dark through this very center portion. If you look here, right, it stays pretty dark through here. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm showing that on my picture as well. Right, that goes all the way down in here. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and start my other layers coming out this way here. So I'm going to bring this out here, and again, I'm just light layering. Okay, I want to make sure that I still have a nice transition going on here. Just like this. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing over here. Because you can see this is a little bit of a harsher transition for this line. This one's much more of a smooth transition. So I want to make sure that it looks like that in my final project, in my final layer. Okay, but again, layering out just a little at a time. Okay, and I'm pressing lighter for these lighter areas here. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in layer number 3. Okay, so that I've done 2 layers so far. Okay, I'm starting to get a more defined sections, right? I'm starting to get darker values here. So I'm going to add in layer number 3. And again, I always start with the darkest part. And I build up my layers gradually. Okay, so I have my darker areas again, and then I'm going to work on my lighter areas for layer number 3. Okay, again, I want to keep my transitions nice and smooth. Okay, we don't want it to look like a striped ball. I want to have nice, smooth transitions. I'm going to go nice and light all the way up here. And I'm going to go lightly down here as well. And then build this up right here. Okay, so that's layer number 3. I'm going to go ahead and do layer number 4, and I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so here is layer number 4. I'm now working on layer number 5. Okay, so in my darkest areas, I'm starting to use a medium to hard pressure. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit because, one, it helps make sure my texture is nice and even, but also when you're shading in, if you color in one direction, sometimes the paper doesn't always pick up all of the lead that you're putting down. And so if you go in the opposite direction, it's a little bit more thorough in shading in that space. It's kind of like if you like brush your hair and you brush it one way, maybe you brush it forward and then you brush it back, or you brush it down, but then you kind of brush it to the side a little bit. And that seems to make it a little bit more thorough. This is kind of similar, I suppose. Okay, so I'm going in opposite directions. My darkest areas, I'm using medium hard pressure. So I can really lay down that oh my gosh, what is it called? that dark area, the lead. I can really darken this up here. Okay, and then I want to continue my darkest areas, kind of going this way. And I have like a sort of a triangular shape here. Okay, so I want to accentuate the darkest area here by shading it in while still keeping the areas that aren't as dark so that they have smooth transitions in them. Okay, so it's good to simplify the shapes that you see, like the general shapes that you see in your picture and the shapes that you see for the different values. of course, because that helps you get the foundation down, but we don't want to leave it looking super triangular. We want it to have a nice transition. So it looks more natural. It looks more like the actual object. Okay, so I'm working still on layer number 5. Okay, but it's coming along. You guys can start to see the dark areas, the lighter areas. I'm really focusing on that. Okay, and then of course I want to make sure that my transitions are still smooth. Going in the opposite direction like this. Okay, remember small circles are your friend, but we don't want to look like there are small circles. We want it to look nice and smooth. Okay, remember if you hold your pencil the way that I suggest to, you are getting most of your lead on your paper. So if I tilt it this way, you can see the lead is touching the paper more instead of being up like this where only the tip is touching. Okay, so I'm laying down all this nice lead. Working on my smooth transitions. Okay, and this was layer number 5. I'm going to build this out just a little bit more this way. Using a light pressure now because I'm in a light area. Same thing over here. I'm going to use a medium to light pressure because I'm in a medium to light area. The weird thing about shading on the side of your pencil is that your pencil doesn't get dull. It ends up getting really, really sharp, but you still end up having to sharpen it because the sides are too thin because you've shaded so much on them. So I think I'm going to have to end up sharpening my pencil soon so I have more lead to work with. All right, so this is number 5. I'm going to go in for number 6. I'll see you back in just a minute. Okay, so we have layers number 6 done. I'm finishing up layer number 7. If you get to layer number 7 and you're like, man, I don't know, I feel like I need to go a little bit longer. Maybe you need 8 layers because one of your layers you didn't press quite as hard as you needed to. That is fine. Okay, 7 is not necessarily the magic number, but you usually want to do at least 7 layers, especially with work, since we're working with this particular type of pencil. Okay, so I'm shading this in here. I'm adding lots of layers to everything everywhere. Okay, now when I get to this point, and I need to make my darker area as dark as I possibly can, I'm gonna transition that out a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so when I get to this point, okay, I want to turn my pencil and focus on using kind of this point here because then I can get a little bit of a harder pressure, which is what I wanted to avoid in the beginning because I was building up my layers gradually. Okay, but now that I have a really, really good foundation, I mean, basically my sphere is totally built, I'm going to go in. And again, I don't want it to be super liney, so I'm not up here. I'm still kind of at the side, but it's tilted up more so I can get more pressure towards the end of my lead. And I'm going to darken up these areas here. Again, I want to be careful to lighten up towards the lighter areas because I don't want to end up with a weird directional line. And I don't want to end up with an accidental oopsie line. And I want to make sure that I don't end up having to erase something because that would be a bummer because you just built up 7 layers and if you have to erase part of it, poof. Okay, so I'm adding in this here. Okay, again, it's getting a little bit darker, but you can't really see my pencil lines. Okay, partially because of how I'm shading this in, but because I also have all these layers already. If I were doing this on a brand new fresh piece of paper, you would definitely be able to see the texture that I'm putting down. Okay, but it's less obvious since I already have a nice smooth texture going on here. Okay, and I'm going to darken this up just a little bit right in here. Oops, see, look, I just did the thing that I said not to do. Oof, that's what happens when you rush, man. All right, so I'm gonna build that up, back up, blend it in. Okay, luckily I wasn't using too much pressure or else that would have been devastating. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about this. I have a nice, really dark area here. It stays a little dark throughout here. Actually, I might have a little bit more. Okay, back to what I was saying. So I have this nice dark area here. I have a good transition here that I'm going to blend out just a tiny bit more. Okay, I still have this nice light area up here. I have some good transitions going on. Right, then I've slowly built up my layers of value. So I do have a very light area. I have a very dark area. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and draw in the lines for my background. And I'm going to say that maybe my background kind of goes here. So it's a straight line across, all the way across here. Okay, and I'm going to shade in my shadow now. Okay, now usually you can press a little bit harder. It still is nice to do some layers to it. I'm going to darken this up so I don't accidentally lose my sphere. Right along here. And right now I'm kind of using the side and tip of my, like the very tip of my pencil. So I can be very specific about where my shadow is going in here. And so also I can make sure it's dark enough that I don't accidentally lose my sphere and my shadow, end up with this weird mass, this weird loss of shadow or loss of sphere. Okay, so it looks kind of like this. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and shade in the rest of my shadow now. Okay, and I want to make sure that it's nice and dark like it is in my picture. In your picture, you might end up having that kind of like double shadow. Okay, and you can put that in your drawing here. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and finish up my shadow here. Again, layering is nice, so you might end up doing 2 layers, 1 or 2 layers here, maybe 3, but you can press much harder because you know that it's going to be darker according to your picture. It's not as testy as the values on our sphere. Okay, so we'll be right back. Okay, so I have 1 layer in here, and if you notice, this is not great craftsmanship. Okay, my shadow doesn't really look like this. There's a lot of directional lines. It's not a good time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over that using a hard pressure on the side of my pencil. And if you end up with some directional lines, it's always good to kind of go the opposite direction that they're going. So if you have side lines that are going side to side, try turning your page and going the opposite direction to help get rid of those. Okay, and we of course want to make sure that we are going right up to the edge of our paper. Okay, but if you go in the opposite direction, it will help get rid of those lines a little bit, and it will give you a smoother, more even value in there with less texture. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I'm laying this down here. So it's a nice dark value. Okay. So almost finished here. One of the things you have to be careful of is your fingers getting pencil on them. Okay, be very aware. You don't want to accidentally stick it in the middle of your highlighted area because that would be a really sad time since it's supposed to be bright white and then you have to go back and kind of redo it. Okay, so I have my shadow done. I feel like the corner is the hardest part. Okay, and then for my background, I'm going to shade these in too. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with my top one up here. Shading kind of softly and carefully against this because I don't want to make my sphere look weird. Okay, so I'm going to shade this in nicely here. Okay, you can build up the layers if you need to. I like to try to choose a value that's going to be, that's going to make the values of my sphere pop out a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to put these in here. And then I'm going to finish shading my top part and then my bottom part here. Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. In part 2 that I'll be adding here in just a little bit, we'll talk about the completed background, and then we're going to discuss how to label your sphere correctly and what that looks like on yours to make sure that we are getting as many points as possible on our project for this. Okay, I know it's only 20 points, but it is worth 60% of your grade. Okay, so I'm shading this in here, making sure this is nice and smooth. Okay, so you can still see I don't have a harsh line really. You don't see a nice harsh outline. It just kind of, it's different enough that I can see the contrast, right? Which is really what I'm looking for. Okay, and then of course I'm going to shade below this line as well. And I'm probably going to go with a much lighter shade, so this will probably kind of look like this. Darken this up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and shade in super light here so that it's not plain white, but you can see where my table is. Okay, because the only thing that doesn't have a value, the only thing that's bright white is the very highlight. Okay, so this has a value on it. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but up close, you can see that. Okay, and same thing over here because I don't want to have any, oops, I don't want to have any line showing up. I just want it to be values. Okay, and then I think I'm going to darken up this edge just a little bit more. So there's more of a contrast. You can see, hey, this is a tabletop now. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and lightly shade this in. Okay, so stay tuned for part 2 where we go over the labels. See you soon.